I'm Dr. Stephen Mainzer, Assistant Professor of Landscape Architecture. I think one of the most important things to consider to be a successful grad student is how you go about finding an advisor who shares your interests, who is somebody that you can work well with, and is somebody who's going to push you to better understand that thing that you care about. Because the biggest difference between undergraduate and graduate education is how much more individualized your pursuits are as a graduate student. Your coursework is very important, but what's even more important is how you apply that knowledge to whatever your individual interests are. And a strong working relationship with your graduate advisor is going to play a big part in how successful that process is, how quickly you move through that process, and what your paths or your journey looks like after you graduate. The work that I'm currently interested in that might potentially benefit graduate students is um, going back to how since the 90s, our country has grown increasingly partisan to the point where it's become really difficult to advance any kind of proactive environmental actions, if not actively taking steps backwards right now. Now, landscape architects make up less than 1% of the voting population. So we kind of have to seek impacts that are bigger than our own actions. Now, we know that those actions are behaviors, and how we make decisions comes in part from who we are, but also in part from our coupled human and natural environments. Now, as a country, we're coping with significant uncertainty right now about the environment, about our health, about civil unrest, about race. And I'm interested in trying to understand how we might help ameliorate some of that stress and uncertainty by exploring on a large countrywide scale um, what is it about the combination of our social and biophysical environments that influences political actions that we take towards some of these issues. Now, graduate students who share an interest in any of those problems will benefit by working towards those, by learning the ways that we frame these problems, different methods of studying them, and hopefully taking some ownership in a small part of one of those questions that they get to learn and dissect and put back together as part of the research process. So there's two subjects right now that I'm currently pursuing and I think will become a longer part of my future agenda. The first is sort of the basic question of what are the environmental influences that affect how we choose to vote or and whether or not we vote, what drives voter turnout. And those are the big picture social biophysical systems. If you live in a heavily forested or a prime agricultural land area, does that in any way impact the political choices that you make? Early findings suggest that, yeah, maybe, but there's a lot more to dig into there. And the second is kind of an emerging interest of mine that's based on some timely concerns is how is COVID-19 spreading across the country? How is that spread different in urban and rural areas? What was the role of the politically influenced big policy decisions like the opening and closing of states? And perhaps most importantly, who was affected by those decisions, especially in terms of race and ethnicity? So those are kind of the two big topics that I'm moving forward with, hopefully in the near future. But what we do is I think we kind of can have the conversation with everybody and says, well, actually, all these things meet at a key nexus, and we have the methods and skill sets to begin studying that, but also to engage in dialogues with those allied professions. The advice that I have for graduate students, especially as ones that are starting out on their graduate studies path, is to step back and see that the field of landscape architecture is so wide, and it's increasingly growing in breadth seemingly almost every day, that you cannot be an expert in everything. We study and we work with just too many different types of systems, addressing too many different types of problems. So especially early on in your graduate studies, find something that you care deeply about and work to understand it, to figure out how you're able to best communicate that. And it's going to be different for everybody, so that you can start to become an advocate for that thing that you care deeply about and start to affect meaningful change. Now, the flip side of that is if you kind of try and dig into everything, you want to be a stormwater expert and you want to be a geospatial expert and study sociology and ecology, you end up becoming a generalist, which is not a bad thing. But at the graduate level, your path will go a little bit easier, and you, I think, will generate more rewarding things if you're willing to commit to specializing at least a little bit. Yeah, and it's such a critical discussion to have with yourself about, um, in any physical site or any landscape that you're working on, or more specifically, the problems that are associated with that site, is how are you going to frame them in a way that, as a student, your interests are there, and so you're going to pursue the problem aggressively, and you're going to transform yourself into an advocate for whatever comes out of it, but also one that kind of fits your natural skill set, or the skill set that you want to grow towards. Not everyone starts out really good at doing kind of freehand sketches, but if you do it, a couple times a week, the entire time you're here, eventually you get quite to be quite strong at it. And it's such an important piece of the puzzle for graduate students, because you are starting to generate something new that needs to be out there in the world. And
Mhm.
so figuring out how are we going to communicate that? Is it through kind of the traditional digitally rendered plans? Or do you have other skill sets that you can start to say, I discovered this interesting thing, or I'm thinking about this interesting thing. It needs to get out in the world. So how are we going to do that? Are we going to write about it? Are we going to show it? Are we going to photograph it? Lots of different ways to go, but getting really effective at one of them, or perhaps a small pool of them, is going to benefit you and hopefully kind of a broader audience as well.